It's Anthony Semann from Semann Slattery, and I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Peter Moss, the 2023 Semann Slattery Thinker in Residence. I want to acknowledge that we're filming on the land of the Gadigal people, which is part of the Eora Nation. And Semann Slattery maintains its commitment to undo the harmful and ongoing effects of colonisation, alongside Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues. I would love to talk about the educational project that we know as Reggio Emilia, but if we could start, if you could share with us your encounters with people like Loris Malaguzzi.
Right, well, I'm afraid there's not much to share, and I'm very embarrassed about this. In the 1980s, I was doing a lot of work for the European Commission with a network of experts, and it was a lot of policy stuff, basically, about work and family life and all that sort of thing. And I got invited to the sort of thing Reggio Emilia did quite frequently, which was a big international conference, which took place in their opera house, and you'd be on a stage confronted by hundreds and hundreds of people in tiers and tiers of opera seats. And I was asked to speak on something I know about European policy on work, family life, really slightly dull. So I knew nothing about Reggio. I got the invitation, I toddled along, and it was all a bit overwhelming. I had no idea what I was doing there in this rather interesting environment. And there were sort of people who I knew were rather famous but didn't quite know much about. There was a guy there called Paolo Freire.
Yes.
And similar people who I kind of thought, yeah, I think I've heard of this guy, he's quite important. And then there was Loris Malaguzzi, who was very polite and nice and things. And I had no idea who he was, or I had no idea what this place was. And I went home, and I think I probably said to my wife, I've no idea what that was all about. And then for many years, well, for a number of years, I had no more further contact. And then, through serendipitous reasons, I got to meet Gunilla Dahlberg and began to work with her. And Gunilla had been going with people from Sweden to Reggio from the 1970s. They were amongst the first people outside Italy to pick up something that was going on, and going down in dribs and drabs and so forth. And Gunilla had been going there for years. She built a rapport with Malaguzzi. He died in '94, but with the rest of the people. And in fact, Sweden was the first country which had a Reggio project with Reggio, right, because Malaguzzi said basically, I think what you have in Sweden and what we have, we share a lot of values and ideas, so I feel I can kind of trust you. So through Gunilla and writing Beyond Quality, and she led on writing the two chapters about Reggio Emilia and pedagogical documentation, I began to get glimmerings of what this was all about on there. And I think through Gunilla, she kind of, I got what I see as a second chance, that I got invitations to go there. And because I had begun to get a glimmering, I then could get a second and third glimmering by meeting people and talking to people. And then in the 2000s, we started this book series, Contesting Early Childhood, and we had a number of books written by people like Carlina Rinaldi and Vea Vecchi. And because I did quite a lot of editing because of the translation on them, and that was a wonderful way of understanding. I remember Gunilla and I did what I thought was a wonderful interview with Carlina, which goes in the back of the book, called In Dialogue with Reggio Emilia. So through all these ways, and also because in the 1980s I was a bit of policy wonk, and in the 1990s I began to understand that you can't just talk about policy until you have some understanding of pedagogy and what sort of pedagogy you think is important. So late in the day, I had to kind of get to grips with that through Reggio Emilia, and then try and begin to link my thinking about how should we organise things with what do we want going on in things. And again, Reggio Emilia, because it's very well organised, they got very good policies, and they got very good pedagogy, was a very good way of helping me with that task. So it was a long road, and without having the guidance of people like Gunilla, I would never have got back onto it.
She's an amazing woman.
She is amazing.
Yeah, we were blessed to have her as our thinker in residence just before you. So
yeah. And she of course knew Malaguzzi very well.
Yes.
I only had this rather unsatisfactory for him conversation with him as a very callow, youngish researcher.
Might seem like a very simple question, but it's actually a very complex answer that might come from this, which is, what is Reggio? Many people don't know of the history of this educational project, and it's often misinterpreted. How do you bring a synopsis, a summary of what is Reggio?
Well, I do use the term a local cultural project, and not, as they say, approach, because I don't think it is something that is there to be generalised, because it comes out of a very particular context, as indeed do most education. So basically, it is a city which in the 1960s and 70s said, we have very little for our young children, we want to take responsibility for building an education for them, and we're not going to take any education, we are going to think and research and develop our education. So, and I think where they start, and this would be, of course, a famous question, is what is our image of the child? And Malaguzzi would famously say, you can't really have a proper project or whatever unless you ask that question, and they did. So they start off with an idea that children they're born with 100 languages, in other words, they have enormous potentialities, and if we're not careful, all we do is end up robbing children of all these things. So it seems to me one of the things that they're very strong on is acknowledging that even the youngest child is a child with these enormous potentialities, and one role of education is to nourish and sustain and evolve those potentialities. Hence, for example, the emphasis they put on certain types of language, which you might loosely put under the heading of art, so that they would have ateliers, art workshops, atelieristas, art-educated people working alongside, but not separately, as an integral part of a team of educators alongside teachers, because they want to bring in different perspectives. So another thing is this enormous value they would put on diversity of perspective. A third feature that increasingly occurs to me and comes back to the idea of the problem with prophetic pedagogy is that for them, education is not about the reproduction of things we already know. I think they would say, of course, there are competencies and skills that we need to acquire, but that education is about the formation of the individual, of their knowledge, their values, their identity. So it's a constant process, and that you do this in relationship with other people, and not knowing where that process of formation is necessarily going to lead you. I think Carlina puts it very nicely. She says something like, if we educate children knowing the outcomes, then we stunt them.
Yes.
And that's a theme that other people have worked with. Hence, people like Malaguzzi talking a lot about ideas like wonder. Gunilla always tells this story that when she'd been there for some time, he would come up to her and say, Gunilla, what has made you wonder today? And what has surprised you? What hadn't you expected? So
what a stunning question.
Yeah. So again, it's taking me away from saying, I've noticed these are things I'm looking for, into things I haven't been looking for, but now I know I should be I should be very conscious of them. But there are so many other elements of this project. Like project work, which is I think very central to the idea about education as this process of formation, the idea of a pedagogy of relationships and listening. So education is about theory building, testing it, listening, being contestation, going back to the drawing, all those sort of things. Pedagogical documentation, we've touched on. This is a very important way of being researchers and experimenters, and that is very central. They would see learning as being a process of research and experimentation. It has many components, but I see it coming back to this concept that it's an education that's been a project that has evolved. They use the word evolve a lot over years, in which their ideas have constantly moved and changed and not mummified, to use that word. Yes. Malaguzzi doesn't want education to be like.
A colleague once said to me, it's like you can conceptualize it as a train at a station we're trying to catch up to them, but every time we get to that train station, they've left.
Yeah.
Where there's this constant evolution that happens in practice.
Because they're intellectuals, they're also looking and thinking about what's going on.
Yes.
Maybe the terrible wars that are going on, or it may be new theories or new technologies, and that's coming in.
Yes.
So their thinking is moving because they are intellectuals and constantly curious about what's happening.
I've got a quote here by Malaguzzi. He says, I remember, when he talks about the educational project and Reggio, I remember these were times after the liberation when everything seemed possible after the war, after the grief, after the ruins. There was a very strange phenomenon. It was a ridiculous capacity of being able to think anything and to think that anything could be physically realised.
Yeah.
I love that quote because it's beautiful, isn't it? It speaks about, for me, the intersectionality between crisis and hope. Why do you love that? I mean, it won't be a competition of who loves it most, but why do you love that? Because to me, it's a hopeful pedagogy.
I partly love it because of the way it's towards the end of his life, and he's writing about his early years, and the whole thing is wonderful. Because he's talking about. I mean, he was living through this awfulness of fascism, war, Nazi occupation, being bombed, and then coming out of it, and what you get in it too is that it's not just him. He's describing this kind of ruined society emerging. So he writes about how people after the war are forming. I think he used the word circles, and people who are interested in culture. They're getting groups forming, and then they're reading, talking. They're going off to the opera. They've got politicians and local councils who are very progressive, but who are wanting to change and build something better, of which the schools are part of something bigger going on and elsewhere. We should not forget this is not just going on in Reggio. Many cities are doing the same with young children and in lots of other ways. They're building a better society, and I think we live. One of the terrible things about neoliberalism is this motto: "There is no alternative," and I think that's really made it so difficult for people to have hope, because they find it. They end up governing themselves to say, "I can't really say that. That's daft. That's stupid. It'll be laughed at, or you'll be told to go. You must be crazy." But I don't think there was that feeling then. I think people could say, let's build a new theatre. Let's repair the theatre and have a new. So, for example, Malaguzzi is very interested in the theatre. He's a theatre director and everything. And one of the things they do is have a cheap theatre ticket programme, including transport. So what they would say is, theatre's been very snobby and everything beforehand. We want people to be able to go. We have cheap tickets. We have cheap transport. So is that kind of thinking? We want people to be able to participate in a better life than they've had before.
The idea of there is no alternative has perhaps served the neoliberal project as a successful tool or a technology. But maybe that crisis, the crisis we find ourselves, has diminished that tool.
Yeah, I think many people,
that weapon.
Many people say the financial crisis of 2008 shot neoliberalism's credibility to pieces, because it showed that unfettered markets actually don't work. I remember the chair of the Federal Reserve in America, Greenspan, when he was called before Congress. After that, really saying, I couldn't imagine that all this chaos could happen. I thought markets sorted themselves out. So I think that sort of assertiveness is weaker, but still people can advocate things like marketization without much fear of serious criticism. So these things are still quite powerful.
I have a closing question. And it's provocative in nature, because it perhaps is a mirror to the world today, that the educational project of Reggio Emilia is more than a recipe. And I think it's been galvanised as a marketing tool, perhaps to the horror of those who are working within that project in Reggio.
Yeah, I'm sure it has. I'm sure people around the world put up their nursery plates which saying, you know, Reggio Emilia style. I don't know what you can do about that. And I think Reggio Emilia is always in a slightly vulnerable situation. Its situation in its city and in Italy is never secured. It is very important that it maintains a lot of support globally. And so it has to sometimes balance things. It has to walk, as my colleague Gunilla Dahlberg says, on two legs. And that's always a difficult task, so you don't end up doing the splits. So, yeah, I think it is a problem. I think there needs to be more discussion about why Reggio Emilia is important, and there also needs to be more discussion of the fact that there are other important projects, past and present. You
Yes.
know, there's a danger of weighting it as being the one and only, and of course, not only does that annoy people elsewhere in Italy, but in other countries, it's not true. There are other people doing very important work, and you know, perhaps we need to be more aware of those.
Well, the risk there, then it becomes the story of quality rather than a story of quality.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that Reggio is really, really important for is its longevity, and it's
60 years, yeah?
60 years, and it's a system. So it's not one school doing something interesting over 10 years. It's over 50 schools doing something interesting over 60 years. So to me, as well as what they're doing, it's this whole issue of how they have managed that. The conditions are equally important, and because I don't think we have any other examples that have such longevity and such breadth.
Well, it's wonderful that in a world of crisis, they've remained a driving force of intellectual work, and I'm sure we will continue to draw influence from the work that they do there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Peter.